Welcome to Dialogues for Change. Life is not a void to be filled. It is a plenitude to be discovered. Today, I would like to share with you some beautiful thoughts from Scott Eastham on how is wisdom communicated, which was the theme of one issue of the journal Interculture. I would especially like to share some of his thoughts on knowledge and its difference with wisdom. Logic is like the sword. Those who live by it shall perish by it. What happens when one bit of information contradicts another? Or when entire dimensions of human concern are excluded because they do not fit into the generalized categories we today perceive as information? What happens when misinformation, deliberate or accidental, is uncritically passed through the automatic system? What happens when the development of modern communication techniques corrodes traditional values and entire ways of life? What happens when the individual human being, instead of being nourished by the nutrient-rich environment of information, is boggled by the complexity and begins to tune out? What happens when the profit and loss categories and cost-benefit analysis of post-industrial capitalism prove inadequate to the enormous task of understanding this world of ready information, let alone one another? What happens, in short, when we discover we no longer know how to reliably sort and file all the data? Or, a step further along the same line, what happens when we question not only one or another bit of data, or our criteria for making specific judgments, but our intrinsic ability to know anything at all? What happens in these and many similar situations is that we begin asking or reformulating perennial philosophical questions about the scope and character of our knowledge. Here is the dominant concern of the second generation of communication studies, the critical theorists. How do we really know that we know what we suppose we know? We instantly become aware that there are no pure facts. There are only facts for somebody, some consciousness. All information is mediated and therefore biased, slanted, off-kilter, due partly to the medium used to transport it, due partly to personal and social context, and due partly to outright manipulation. We have become aware of the taxonomic strategies of the various regimes of knowledge and the consequent epistemologies of control operating in given societies, particularly those ruled by the vast marketplace of multinational capitalism. After Jacques Ellul's work in the 60s, one might have expected that propaganda techniques would assure the final domination of ends by means in the technological society. And today, to all appearances, just this has come to pass. Knowledge is power, chimed Francis Bacon and Michel Foucault in strained chorus, the one attempting to inaugurate the modern technocratic era, the other attempting to write its postmodern epitaph. Both were mainly concerned, for very different reasons, with the kinds of knowledge that facilitate control. Foucault mapped the underside of modern society and dissected its mechanisms for excluding certain sorts of knowledge, for labeling and circumscribing deviance, for restricting human experience to parameters which can be controlled in the interests of social order and the powers that be. Likewise, in the 60s and 70s, when Jürgen Habermas and the Marxist critical theorists of the Frankfurt School began exposing various social, political and economic regimes of knowledge, feminist critiques were unmasking and disrobing patriarchal structures everywhere. And even Illich and his so-called neoconservative cohorts were demonstrating that institutions invariably subvert the values they were instituted to preserve. Now, decades after Vance Packard, it is not surprising to see Chomsky, Herman, Tuchman and Elalaya resetting their sights on corporate hegemony of the mass media, which are, before and after all, big businesses. Critical social theory operates not as a unitary system, but as a range of attempts to locate the social context which enable or compel specific actors and audiences to construct meaning and power relationships of dominance and oppression in particular ways. While the sociology of knowledge is nothing new, most of these contemporary applications are certainly novel. The importance of such ideology critiques can scarcely be overstated. They had to be done, and they have been done well. These are necessary critiques, to be sure. But are they sufficient? Beneath the present preoccupation with controlled knowledge as a form of power, there is the basic philosophical question about the limits of human knowledge altogether. As we saw earlier, there are two intrinsic boundaries to knowledge: the knowing subject and the known object. And the ultimate subject of knowledge has turned out to be quite as elusive as the ultimate object of quantum physics. These limits, briefly sketched earlier, have led some contemporary analytic philosophers, most notably Richard Rorty, to conclude that this century's attempt to ground philosophy in a definitive epistemology has come to a dead end. As Nietzsche foresaw, and Martin Heidegger demonstrated, Western metaphysics leads directly to the positivistic philosophy underlying modern science, which has tried and failed to be the mirror of nature, a perfect model or description. Rorty and others have strongly suggested giving up this quest for the ultimate epistemological frame of reference and concentrating instead on keeping open the conversation between different worlds of discourse. Precisely the conversation in which we always, already, and inevitably find ourselves immersed. Habermas similarly insists that we may overcome instrumental action by focusing instead on what he calls communicative action, also necessarily an interdisciplinary agenda. So far, so good. But if we can know nothing for sure, except the relativity of our own knowledge, this opens the door for a full-blown deconstruction of the canons of the classical Western tradition. Finally, what can we know? How to affirm anything at all? How to celebrate and commemorate? How to recall and transmit those crucial affirmations? What splendor it all coheres, that knit a living society together. Television-saturated North American culture can no longer even teach its children to read and write, let alone to do their ciphers. How in such an environment is the wisdom of one's own tradition transmitted, and in such a way as to be also hospitable to the wisdom of other traditions? In short, how is wisdom communicated? Within a given culture, and just as urgently between cultures as well. Well, Scott Eastham continues to develop this idea of how wisdom may be communicated in the following pages of this article. But I will leave you here with this question so that you can ponder it a bit by yourself. And I hope it will inspire you on this Friday, 15th of June, 2012. Thank you.